Origin of a demon. They started as bankers, merchants, and makers of weapons and ships in Florence and Venice. In Venice, they used modular construction techniques to build galleons, one a day. Galileo was helping them, the guy that built the telescope to see the rings of Saturn. It was a shipbuilding factory using canals, the same canals that our tourists today marvel at in Venice. The bankers managed the Pope's money. This was the seed money for the whole ungodly operation. Oh yeah, the Pope is filthy rich. He is still deep in it. After the New World was discovered in 1492, Northern Europe began to flourish with trade. The demons began their northward move, first up into Switzerland and Austria, excuse me. They moved north. The bankers moved to Amsterdam in 1609, opening the Bank of Amsterdam, and likely joined forces with the descendants of the Vikings. Then they opened the Bank of Hamburg in 1619 and the Bank of Sweden in 1661. Then it got interesting. 1609, the demons started the Bank of Amsterdam. 1619, Hamburg. 1661, Sweden. The northward push had begun. The Hudson Bay and East India Companies. These were probably the most profitable companies of all time. Greater than 60% annual dividends for hundreds of years. 1670 was the inclusion of the Hudson Bay area, Hudson Bay Company, another company that paid huge dividends for hundreds of years. Company was just sold around 2000 for $1 billion. They backed King William III in his coup against King James II in 1688, who let him create the Bank of England in 1694. They decided to conquer the world. By 1730, in addition to the opium and the spices they got from India, they took over Madagascar, and they shipped a lot of slaves from Madagascar. They were heavily into the slave trade. They were busy making money, at least the way they did, caused a lot of victims. In their conquest, they killed a lot of people and just let a lot of others just suffer from starvation. England, 700,000. Bay of Bengal, up to 10 million. India, 500,000. Ireland, another million. India again, 4.5, 5 million. Persia, Iran, they lost over half the population. South Africa, 50,000, mostly women and children. This is where the Brits invented the concentration camp during the Boer War. The men that they captured were shipped overseas while their women and children were put in concentration camps where they starved to death. 1700s, spices and food from India and Bengal. Even though the locals needed the food, they shipped it to England or other places in their empire and sold it. And they, once again, a lot of slaves from Madagascar shipped them all over their empire.
The main changes we see by 1788 was the inclusion of New Zealand and Australia. So they had a huge trade across all those areas. A lot of money coming to England.
1800s, the East India Company had a 250,000-man army, along with fleets of armed merchant vessels. They used this force to subjugate hundreds of millions. In those countries, they were God. They shipped millions of pounds of opium from India to China and the world every year. Tobacco, sugar, cocaine, gold, silver, copper, and most importantly, saltpeter for gunpowder came from the Americas. Silk and fine china from Asia. Slaves and later gold and diamonds from Africa. Then came railroads, oil, electricity, and the Industrial Revolution. And all along the way, they were making weapons of war and fostering conquest around the world.
By 1801, we're seeing huge changes. We're seeing the inclusion of Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand, India, Madagascar, and then new places in Africa. Egypt, all the way south, just north of South Africa, and portions of West Africa. They plundered resources across this entire region. And this was also the period of time that they took Ireland.
Revolutions. When the downtrodden rebelled, they found it was far cheaper to just let them go. But they would use bribes in their newspapers to get their own agents elected. This let them have their cake and eat it too, just like they did in the US in 1776. But it wasn't enough. They wanted the whole earth. To quicken the pace, they engineered world wars and revolutions.
1817. This was also the period when General Simon Bolivar arranged for the conquest of Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, Ecuador. He was financed by the Brits.
Realms like Russia and China were problems. They did not let them in. They would attack both of these issues at the same time, from the east and the west. They used their superior guns to subdue the Emperor of China and forced open the door of China to vast imports of opium. Foreigners would split the country into 8 parts, effectively taking it over. Churches were free to buy land and build churches. In Japan, the emperor was a figurehead. The samurai had near total control of the country. So the demon gladly helped out and gave him gold, ships, and guns to fix it. From like 1860 to 1900, they gave him dozens of ships, steel ships with good guns. The Emperor of Japan had climbed into bed with the demon. In 1868, the Boxer War started, and within 2 years, the samurai were outlawed. Then they helped him start the Japanese Empire by selling him, giving him dozens of steel ships. They started their expansion with Okinawa, then Korea and Taiwan. The American Navy helped. And the Japanese Empire was financed in large part by opium sales. Whenever they took over an area, they would go in and kill all the local opium dealers and open up their own shops.
On this slide, we can see the inclusion of China over to the east. And it's not read yet because the emperor is technically in charge of China, but the British had guns and cannons that shot far longer than the primitive cannons and rifles that the Chinese used. They were using more of a musket while the British were using rifles. And they were shooting out 600 yards. And their cannons, I have no idea how far, but they were shooting further than the Chinese cannons. So they didn't have much trouble defeating any Chinese forces that they came across. So the Emperor of China had to concede to any demands that the British placed on them. And this was a time of after the oil had been discovered, actually not discovered, but how to refine it, how to make kerosene. And kerosene was the new light of the night. Previously, sperm whales had been used to light the lanterns of the rich, but when kerosene was invented, the process to refine it, the oil rush was on, and that's when the oil boom started. And to really implement their oil boom, they had to go over here, right in this area. That's where they had saltpeter deposits up in the desert, high deserts of the Andes. And these deposits were, there was enough of it that they could commercially mine it. And they used this to make gunpowder, a very high quality gunpowder. And this was shipped over to Japan and around their entire empire. And it gave them uh, very high quality firepower when other people were having to use leaching methods to get saltpeter out of cesspools. Uh, it was quite a achievement.
Exploding battleships. Big money does not go away. It moves to new investments, bigger deals. That's what they did. Slaves went to tobacco, to drugs, to oil, diamonds, and gold. But that was all small change. They wanted control of the world's money supply. To get there, they went through the Spanish Empire. And to destroy the Spanish Empire, they would sabotage the USS Maine in 1898, starting the Spanish-American War. In 1900, there was new atrocities across the world. We took the Philippines and Cuba, and the British took South Africa, the gold and diamond fields. This was after around the Boer War. They killed 50,000 in that area. We killed another 50,000 on Samar Island alone in the Philippines. The general in charge said, kill everybody above 10 years old. Mark Twain was outraged and wrote extensively against the whole operation. But we would stay in the Philippines until the Japanese took it from us in 1941. And then we finally conceded and let them form their own country in 1945. In the West, Cuba, we took that over also. Got all the tobacco and sugarcane fields. It did take quite a, not as big a battle as they did in the Philippines. Spanish didn't fight nearly as hard as the Filipinos. Revolutions take a long time. A lot of planning. Lenin, Trotsky, Sun Yat-sen, and Charlie Soong spent years in Japan, Switzerland, America, and England, preparing, planning. We used gold, priests, missionaries, newspapers, and lies. The U.S. would be integral in the infiltration and destruction of the Chinese and Russian imperial dynasties. The creme de la creme for the demon was Russia and China. And you'd think from history that, these things were kind of spontaneous and, they happened overnight. And, the Chinese just got upset and, started the Chinese Revolution. Same in Russia, Trotsky and Lenin just went back there and, hey, they kicked up enough fuss that, within a few months they overthrew the Tsar of Russia. But no, these things took over a generation to engineer by the demon. Sun, Song, Trotsky, Lenin, Lenin's brother, they all played a part. And they happened, 30, 40 years before. And it was an accumulation of all their efforts that enabled the demon to overthrow these realms that had lasted 1,000 years. The demon came in, money, gold, religion, missionaries, churches, newspapers, politicians, and America played a big role in the fall of both of them, encouraging their regimes to accept newspapers and accept what they printed, even if they printed things that they really didn't want to see. Yes, we were there. Our ships, our men, thousands of volunteers went to China from America, and I would expect a corresponding amount went to Russia, fostering discontent, financing discontent, and in the end, dragging the Tsar's family, him and the Tsar's family out, killing them in the middle of the night and burying them. Yes. Then they stole his money. Tsar had $15 billion in U.S. banks. That would be today's money. Almost $1 billion back then. And he had a lesser amount in England. And what did the banks do with that money? They kept it. I would expect a lot of that went into the banks that compose the Fed today. It's a scar on America's honor that will never go away. God bless America. God damn the things we've done. Desert sands. The demand for oil exploded when vehicles began to be mass produced. A few years later, in 1932, the Americans found oil in Saudi Arabia. The American Oil Company was born, Aramco. Now, in addition to making money, they begin literally pumping it out of the ground. The British were already strong in this area, in this period. Lawrence of Arabia made movies on him. Very famous. But the inclusion of Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, all the places with oil there. They were all sucked into the demon's fold just quick as can be, where they remain. It's one of the reasons that the Middle East did not experience major battles during the World War II. Some areas did, mostly in North Africa. But the Middle East itself, that was sheltered, remains sheltered to this day. Although they've had wars, these wars have done little to interrupt the flow of oil, which is what the demon holds most dear, at least at this point, other than information. Besides the Middle East, Central America and Spain were the last to go before World War II. At the demon's direction, General Butler would help American corporations take over Central America and the Caribbean. Franco in Spain would test both weapons and the world's appetite for war and social change. They both proved to be insatiable. World War II and after. Like World War I, World War II brought massive change and destruction across Europe and Asia. But at the end, it brought in all the little countries of Europe and Asia and created a safe haven for Nazis in South America. They used it as a social bulldozer to make all those little countries that were just too much trouble for the demon to do one by one. He just did them all at one time. Destroy them. The bankers came in afterwards with loans for rebuilding. Central banks were created wholesale. The Cold War and arms race started and continued to this day. All the related manufacturing kicked off major increases in CO2 and global warming. So all the problems we see today in weather, these people started it. The last picture, we only see the Horn of Africa is the last remaining place. They took it over. Can't say much else. The demon won.